No one expected civilian craft to become the last argument against catastrophe. In the spring of 1940, British and French formations, falling back after the enemy's lightning breakthrough through the Ardennes, were compressed toward a narrow strip of shoreline. On a map it looked like a wedge driven into the sea. On the ground it looked like a long queue of armed men standing on wet sand between water and a line of smoke. Dunkirk ceased to be a port and became a funnel, drawing in the remnants of units, rear echelons, wounded, signals detachments, military police, mechanics, drivers, and gunners without guns. The sky was often gray, but the main enemy was not cloud cover. It was time. Every delay threatened to close the ring. The evacuation was codenamed Dynamo. In staff calculations, the expectation ran to thousands, at best, tens of thousands, extracted. The enemy was advancing fast. Aircraft kept the area under constant threat, and the harbor was partly damaged. Approach channels were cluttered with wreckage and kept drifting back under fire. Large warships could not always come close. Tides worked against scheduling, and the shallow shelf hundreds of meters offshore made a simple embarkation difficult. Normal port rhythm was shattered. Jetties worked and then failed. Barges stuck on the flats. Minesweepers could not keep up. Under those conditions, retreat was framed as a loss minimized, not as an organized, large-scale evacuation. The decisive shift began with a concession to geography. Dunkirk's beaches ran for miles, but water at the lip of the surf could not float destroyers and deep-draft transports. A bridge was needed between the shoreline and ships at anchor. Army engineers threw out wooden ways. Soldiers formed queues on improvised piers. Small craft shuttled like short-haul buses. Even so, capacity remained limited. The answer was the resource few consider a weapon of war: small coastal vessels and private motorboats. The little ships were not a romantic label, but a functional category. The roles produced barge-like workboats, pleasure craft, fishing boats, lifeboats, tugs, yachts, river launches, and small dinghies. They shared two properties: shallow draft and agility in thin water. They could go where big hulls risked grounding or where anchorage kept the big ships too far out. Some had been prerequisitioned for emergency service. Others came with volunteer crews. Still, others were handed over to the Navy with temporary crews and instructions. Each type was matched to a task. Some ferried men from the surf line to transports. Some towed barges. Some evacuated wounded. Some delivered potable water and fuel for the shuttle boats. Organization became the decisive factor. Collection points appeared on shore where units were released to embark in sequence. Lists were drawn quickly, often on scraps of paper, but discipline enforced order. Priority for those holding the outer perimeter, and for wounded, then for formations without heavy weapons to speed unloading. Military police and officers directed flows toward the moles, long stone breakwaters temporarily serving as piers, and toward zones where small craft scooped up groups directly out of the water. Men waded into the thighs and waist, held rifles high, lost boots in the sand. Yet the line did not become chaos. Incidents of panic were contained by the overriding rule: cutting the line saves no one. The maritime scheme worked in layers. Large ships held positions far enough out to be threatened only by heavier batteries and took men up via nets and ladders. Medium craft balanced closer while avoiding shallows. The smallest ran short legs back and forth, moving scores at a time. Maintenance was compressed. Fuel arrived in barrels. Engines overheated. Bilge pumps fought seepage in old hulls. Lines wore out fast. With each day, the system improved. Minesweepers cleared fresh lanes. Signalers refined light codes. Sound cues helped orientation in fog. Tide tables became part of the timetable. Air threat never left. Enemy aircraft hit the roadstead, bombing and strafing, trying to cut the evacuation bridge. Countermeasures were layered: fighter cover, maneuver on the water, smoke screens. Curtains of smoke lay in bands, masking the motion of the small craft. Dispersion discipline reduced the harm from fragments. Damage was frequent, but repair in motion yielded results. Wooden sides were patched with boards and canvas. Holes were stopped. Weakened fixtures replaced with spare bolts and wire. There was no heroization in the routine, only practical resilience. Anything that could move, moved. Numbers began to alter the concept of the possible. The count first rose into thousands, then tens of thousands, then beyond initial staff estimates by large margins. The return flow piers to England became visible at receiving ports. Exhausted men in soaked uniforms, queues at feeding points in dry clothing, medical sorting, redistribution to camps. At each stage, simple rules dominated: warmth, calories, control. This was not triumph, it was salvation by fractions. Dunkirk's paradox was not that an army retreated, but that the retreat became governable. The little ships linked shore to roadstead, roadstead to ports, ports to rear areas. Where the big fleet met physical limits, civilian craft added flexibility. No one expected this to become the operation's backbone, but that is what happened. Shallow draft and short shuttle runs achieved what tonnage and firepower could not. The remaining tasks were to hold tempo, hold the perimeter, and prevent the schedule from collapsing. The story continued, and the principal actors were increasingly those not trained to war as a craft, but who became irreplaceable when the decisive tool was not a weapon, but a tide table and a clock. Everyone was shocked by how quickly improvisation hardened into routine. By the second and third days of Dynamo, the beaches functioned like a system. The main arteries were the east and west mole's long stone breakwaters, where ships took turns under wind and fire. They served as narrow bridges. Columns of soldiers moved along planked surfaces that flexed with sea and stone. Boards laid over concrete creaked. Handrails were braced with wire. Signalmen set lamps so twilight would not break the tempo. At the molehead's embarkation, officers stood with stopwatches. Every pause multiplied through the queue behind into lost hundreds. The shoreline was divided into sectors, one for collection and sorting, one for waiting, one for approach to the water. Field medics pitched tents in the dunes and built a sluice for the wounded bandage, hot drink, sleeve mark, priority boarding. For men numbed by long stands in cold surf, barrels of warm water and blankets were kept near at hand. Military police managed column density. The point was not to cram the maximum into each meter, but to preserve speed and control. Beach teams followed a simple algorithm: movement only forward, no returns, no bracketed detours, every turn signed, each sector under a designated NCO. Seaborne work was tuned to tidal windows. On a board near the senior naval officer, colored marks showed the green hours, when small craft could run right to the lip of the surf. Between those windows, moles carried the weight. Embarkation there fed larger ships at anchor without overloading the shuttles. Minesweepers combed channels each night, charted fresh drifting timber and mines. Radio use near shore was kept minimal. Flags and lamps carried signals so as not to feed the enemy's intercept picture. In the roadstead, senior captains assigned positions who would lie closer or farther, who would swing out first under air attack so as not to clog the approaches. From the sand, air cover could look absent. Bombers were seen more often than fighters, but the calculus differed. Fighter patrols attempted to catch enemy formations farther out, not directly over the waterline. That created an illusion of an empty sky, while sortie counts and claims told another story. Naval smoke discipline added shielding. Smoke generators and improvised fires, rags soaked in fuel through bands that cut sight lines. Small craft used them as corridors, steering by siren and shouted cues at the moles. Under attack, a column on the mole only half froze. Men crouched behind edges and sandbag piles, then rose on command. The essential rule was never to break the rhythm. By day 3 and 4, Most of the flow was normalized around frequency blocks and unit codes. Sector signs carried formation identifiers. Senior sergeants checked rolls. Collected weapons and excess kit were heaped at the dunes to shorten boarding times and lighten shuttle loads. Reverse currents existed too. Units lifted from the perimeter went straight into the line, while fresher groups marched the other way to reinforce the defensive ring sandbag revetments, hedgehog obstacles, firing points along the approaches to town. The perimeter ran on a schedule. Each company knew its relief hour to avoid seams tearing open. It was a kind of needlework under artillery. The harbor, partially wrecked, ran beyond design. Destroyer captains at risk laid stern to the mole to cut maneuver time. Nets and scrambling ladders thrown to the water allowed simultaneous transfers from small boats. On deck, sailors hauled men aboard, cut stuck straps, issued blankets and tea. In the engine rooms, steam sat at the edge of safe range. Departures had to be sudden on the first alarm of another raid. Some ships were lost to bombs and mines. Others, damaged, came home under tow. Losses were handled institutionally. Each failure triggered a reserve plan. Flows were redistributed, sweeping reinforced. On the English side, Dynamo's mirror image ran at port speed. Disembarkation, accountability, medical triage, hot food, dry clothing, registration. Volunteers handed out tea and tobacco, but health drove the template. Temperature, exam, assignment to a camp. Many little ships turned multiple round trips per day. Skippers slept by the hour. Mechanics changed oil on the move. Fuel was passed in deck barrels through small hand pumps. Inside this uncountable routine lived the hidden strength of a civilian fleet. Small port standards, weathercraft, repairs, on the knee, knowledge of shoals, and workable channels. The French factor was crucial. Many French formations held stretches of the perimeter covering the withdrawal. Others departed last. Bilingual signs hung on the moles. Embarkation officers allotted place quotas by Anglo-French ratio to prevent coalition friction from breaking discipline at the worst moment. It helped keep chaos down and prevented dangerous cultural abrasion. At the same time, enemy ground forces tightened the ring, but their tempo did not always align with tide windows and the carrying strength of roads under heavy columns. That asynchrony rare good fortune in an evacuation bought extra hours. By now, the picture was not of a heroic miracle, but of a hard, pragmatic conveyor under fire. Meter by meter, trip by trip, day by day, the rhythm held largely because the people running it knew the sea not as a map, but as a workplace. The Blue Water Fleet, Army engineers, and thousands of small craft tied into a single mechanism. That mechanism enabled the passage from save whoever can be saved to extract everyone who can be reached. Ahead lay the last and heaviest days, when time compresses most brutally and every link in the chain works at its limit. Everyone was shocked by how a narrow band of shoal decided fates. The final dozens of meters from the wash of the surf to a transport side were the costliest stretch. Here, the mesh of small and medium craft, barges, pontoons, and boats lost minutes and won hundreds of lives. The rule was simple: not a single empty run. If a damaged boat still floated, it left with people. If a crew was exhausted but the engine pulled, one more shuttle. The shore worked by algorithms. Sounding poles checked for sandbars. Lines were pre-knotted for instant fastening. Scrambling nets and rope ladders were pre-rigged. Soldiers loosened straps so nothing snagged on ladders. Sappers kept the mole's decking tight, replanking, wedging, spiking. Any delay at the handoff point triggered a chain reaction. One stuck launch postponed the next. Empty patches opened on transport decks. Fatigue accumulated in the beach queue. From mid-operation, the flows were differentiated. Wounded were concentrated in a separate zone and lifted in low freeboard boats with improvised canvas stretchers. Unarmed and lightly equipped went to barges that could take mass and be tugged to transports. Units with seamanship organized themselves, appointing coxswains, balancing loads, preventing capsize. Swell rose and fell. Crews learned to read wave sets as carefully as signal lamps. Air threat set the rhythm. At the first sign of a raid, small craft fanned out. Larger vessels reduced maneuvering to avoid blocking channels. Pre-laid smoke made blind corridors. Fighter cover worked at a distance, intercepting and distracting while embarkation continued. Every minute inside smoke was spent. Nets stayed down, rope ladders hung. Deckhands stood at the mesh hauling hands aboard. Water was cold. Hypothermia was counted in minutes. Thermoses and blankets at the boat side returned basic movement in seconds. Machinery failed and was forced to continue. Engines overheated. Crankshafts groaned. Pumps spat rusty bilge. But field repair was part of the plan. Belts tensioned with pack straps. Gaskets cut from canvas. Leaks stopped with oakum and wedges. A toolbox from crates on the beach hammers, mallets, nippers, nails, and wire kept the fleet going. After 5 or 6 short trips, a launch took 10 minutes of treatment and returned to the line. No one asked for perfection only, function on the next approach. The system learned fast. Capsizes in the shallows produced strict boarding rules. Center of gravity low, rucksacks inboard, rifles lashed, legs along the sides. Commands by gesture and clipped words. Dead space on transport decks led to a dedicated liaison officer who packed the deck tight and redirected excess boats to the opposite side. Mine losses expanded sweeping and shifted channel ranges. Each incident became a brief, and within a day, the fix became standard. French defense on the perimeter held windows for withdrawal. Companies leaving last had preset embarkation hours and were given linked barges and launches so a viable backbone wouldn't be lost. Anglo-French coordination used simplified visual procedures. Unit code, placards, colored pennants, lamps of set rhythm. It killed arguments in critical minutes and split quotas without words. Bilingual traffic teams on the moles dissolved friction with a single baton wave. English ports shifted to night mode. Darkness intake accelerated with pre-split flows. Triage on the quay. Vats of hot tea. Dry clothing stacked high. Tent blocks for first sleep. Trains were spotted in advance cars, signed by destination. Field kitchens ready. The out and back rhythm lived on chalkboards. Each boat ticked for trip, completed, and time of next sailing. Little ship crews slept in turns on deck or in holds under canvas against the dew. By week's end, the numbers formed a picture no one had forecast. The beaches never emptied. They breathed. A dense rank of helmets at the waterline, a thinning band, then another packed front. Yet every ebb showed in the results. Fewer excess bodies in the roadstead, more steaming mugs at English piers, fresh hundreds of names on rolls. The hardest task was the last yard of water, the thin border between order and chaos. The operation's meaning rested on it, pushing mass through a narrow throat with no room for flourish or waste. Only tempo, discipline, and short decisions. This was Dunkirk's adult logic, managing a non-optimal world. Scrambling nets instead of gangways, smoke instead of walls, canvas instead of steel. In sum, it worked. The little ships proved that war is not only fire and iron, but the ability to turn shoal into logistics, and the final minute into a rescued day. Everyone was shocked by the scale of the result. The evacuation shifted from save whoever you can to a managed extraction of an army. By week's end, the rhythm held day and night. The beaches breathed. The moles worked. The little ships ran their short shuttles, and the larger vessels gathered the streams in the roadstead. Losses were inevitable, but the system absorbed shocks. A break in one link was offset by redistribution in another. Sweeping widened corridors, smokescreens stretched in bands, fighters pushed raids away from the waterline. In sum, the operation gained what had been missing from day one time: Function beat mythology. The outcome was decided not by heroic lunges, but by cue discipline, unit code placards, stopwatches at the mole heads, barges trimmed to the right draft, thermoses and blankets at the rails, and on-the-spot repairs that returned boats to service 10 minutes later. French units held the perimeter and received their withdrawal windows. Anglo-French quotas at embarkation worked without breakdown. Bilingual traffic teams eased friction with a gesture. On the English side, a mirror conveyor took the flow. Accountability, medical checks, dry clothing, hot food, distribution to camps, trains, waiting on sidings. Fatigue was the critical variable. Little ship crews slept in snatches under canvas. Mechanics changed oil on the move. Skippers checked tide tables more often than watches. Yet familiarity bred resilience. Each run repeated a learned sequence: disembark, turn back, wait for the window, come up to the mole, make fast, load. Mistakes were logged and converted into rules. Weight distribution, hand signal lexicon, channel ranges, a liaison officer on deck. Simple fixes became standards, and standards became power. Strategically, the evacuation solved two problems. First, it preserved a cadre able to re-enter the line officers, NCOs, specialists. Second, it left room for maneuver, not total encirclement and captivity, but a living reserve that could be rearmed and retrained. Psychologically, that mattered too. Defeat stopped being final. At the level of lived experience, hundreds of thousands passed through the same corridor. Water, net, tea, dry jacket, train, and that repeatable sequence became the practical face of hope. The later miracle myth missed the real value: logistics. That a shallow draft civilian fleet proved critical. That inches of water mattered more than tons of steel. That smoke and light code saved more lives than any improvised counterattack. That flow control under fire is possible if everyone knows the next step. The little ships didn't defeat the enemy. They defeated geography and time, which, in catastrophe, is the highest form of organization. Afterward, there were losses, wrecked piers, condemned hulls, and missing lists. But there was also an army few expected to see again in such numbers. Ports emptied slowly. The beaches kept the scars of improvised decking. On staff maps, the red crosses of entrapment gave way to another symbol: mass withdrawal, completed under fire. No grand phrasing, just rows of figures, sailing schedules, and the names of men whose seamanship and routine discipline turned a narrow shoal into a bridge. That was the outcome: less legend, more work. And it was precisely that work that saved an army no one believed could be saved.